Sterling Tucker, the first elected chairman of the D.C. Council, is being laid to rest today. He passed away July 14th at the age of 95. Sterling Tucker was born in 1923 in Akron, Ohio, coming to D.C. in 1956 as an influential member of the National Urban League. His work promoted entrepreneurship and economic and political empowerment for the disenfranchised. One of his most noteworthy achievements during this time was helping to lead the 1969 Poor People's Campaign with the Reverend Ralph Abernathy and Coretta Scott King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s widow. He was appointed to the Council of the District of Columbia in 1969, and in 1974, with the coming of D.C. Home Rule, Tucker was elected as the first chairman of the council. During his tenure, the council passed one of the toughest handgun control laws in the nation. It also passed a rent control law that influenced multiple other cities. Voting rights were restored to felons in the district, and this early D.C. council even tried to take up gay marriage and marijuana decriminalization years before those issues garnered national attention. In 1978, Tucker ran for mayor against Marion Barry and incumbent Walter Washington. He lost to Barry by just 1.5% of the vote. Despite only losing by about 1,400 votes, Tucker never ran for mayor again. Instead, he took a position as President Jimmy Carter's assistant director of housing and later opened his own consulting firm. Sterling Tucker was uniquely D.C., and he leaves a remarkable legacy. His influence on civil rights and local government continues to be felt to this very day and will be for generations to come. Let's honor his memory as a leader who dedicated his life in service of the people of D.C. Get up.